So, with the tension over Corcyra, over Potidaea, uh, and the Megarian decree, and the refusal of the Athenians to rescind it, despite the Spartans' adamant demand that they do so, some scholars believe this was the straw that broke the camel's back, this Megarian decree, because the Spartans recognized that if the Athenians wanted to, they could use their economic muscle to go polis by polis, shutting people out of the Aegean unless they joined the Delian League, which of course Athens was the head of. So the Megarian decree was kind of a big deal, and given the tension between Corinth and Athens and Sparta's overall suspicion of Athenian intentions, no matter what, it's no surprise that ultimately both sets of alliances, the Athenian Delian League and the Spartan Peloponnesian League, would find themselves at war. And of course, this is a 27-year conflict known as the Peloponnesian War, and we know a great deal about it, again, because of Thucydides. The Peloponnesian War, fought between Athens and its allies, Sparta and its allies, is going to go on for 27 years. And clearly, this is well against the trend in Greek warfare, in which most wars were usually ended with one battle on one afternoon. This thing will drag on for 27 years, in part because, as you can see, both Athens and Sparta had found ways to break out of what was called the agrarian cycle, in which hoplite warfare was conducted along an agrarian calendar. And if you could break out of this cycle, and the Spartans could because they had the helots performing all the agrarian labor, the Athenians could rely on their overseas empire to ship in foodstuffs to keep Athens going, even if there was a hostile army on Athenian soil. So, with both sides able to break the agrarian cycle, we can see a conflict that will go on year after year after year. How each side fought the Peloponnesian War is of interest to us now. This is a conflict that will break many traditions, many protocols that had for centuries defined how the Greeks fought one another. And we'll start with taking a look at Pericles' strategy. Now remember, Pericles was the dominant figure in Athens, having been re-elected year after year after year to the position as one of the 10 strategoi, or generals. So he had great political influence and could shape Athens's long-range strategy. And he has a very unusual idea as to how the Athenians can emerge victorious from any conflict with the Spartans. And it is basically a defensive strategy. The Athenians had constructed and completed what were called the Long Walls, linking the city of Athens with their main port of Piraeus. And these walls were about 4 miles long, and basically they allow a secure conduit by which supplies can be shipped in. And for Pericles, this is the centerpiece of his strategy. In short, he expects the conflict to go on for 2, maybe 3 years, in which the Spartans will invade Attica and do as most hoplite armies would do, and that is to ravage the countryside and hope that the opposing side would come out, meet them for a decisive battle. The Spartans, of course, being the professionals they were, would emerge victorious, and that would be the end of the Peloponnesian War. And Pericles knows that he doesn't want to play the Spartan game, so he feels if we can shelter within the city of Athens and within the Piraeus, if we can get our population to evacuate the countryside and shelter within the fortified area, the Spartans will, yeah, they'll burn our stuff, but ultimately, you know, they're not going to do any long-term damage to us. We'll be able to feed this population by using our navy to ship in grain and other foodstuffs. And after a while, the Spartans will get tired of playing this game, and we'll be able to negotiate a peace. And we will have convinced them that we, the Athenians, cannot be defeated. So very unusual strategy that went against the conventions of hoplite warfare. And so in 431, hostilities commence and the Peloponnesian War begins. Now, this war, as I mentioned repeatedly, will be fought over 27 years. The first 10 years of the war, roughly the first phase of the war, is called the Archidamian War, and named after the Spartan king Archidamus, who will lead repeated invasions from the Peloponnese into Attica to ravage the countryside and hopefully get the Athenians to fight a traditional hoplite battle, something which Pericles is hell-bent on not seeing happen. So this first 10-year period, 431 to 421, is called the Archidamian War. And we will see, again, Athens, I should say the Attic Peninsula and the surrounding areas of Athens outside of the Long Walls being ravaged by the Spartans. But Pericles' plan seems to work. The Athenians are able to ship in enough food to keep the swelled population within the city walls fed. But of course, there are, traditionally and culturally, this was a very difficult thing for particularly the young men of Athens to endure, watching their farms and crops go up in flames, and they are being told not to engage the enemy, not to defend their homeland. It really was a tough challenge for Pericles to harness public opinion and keep the people focused on what the long-term plan was to basically frustrate the Spartans and get a negotiated peace. That's not to say, though, that the Athenian strategy, the Periclean strategy, was without an offensive component. The Periclean strategy did call for Athens to use some of its naval force to raid along the Peloponnesian coast. And that will be a component, but we must remember that, although Athens had a formidable navy, the navy is tasked with a couple of really big missions. Number one, to kind of fly the flag throughout the Aegean, making sure that the Allies stayed loyal. That required a significant naval presence. Number two, ensure that food is being shipped and food supplies are not being picked off at sea. So you have to kind of guard these food convoys. And number three, you have to guard the coastal area around Attica itself. And number four, you are to engage in these kind of raids along the Peloponnesian coast. So this stretched the Athenian navy pretty thinly, and it also prevented a knockout blow. The Athenians were never able to really get a knockout blow against the Peloponnesians in the Peloponnese while the Spartan army was in Attica. Along the same terms, the Spartans were never able to engage the Athenian hoplites, so they were unable to land a knockout blow. So that's why this conflict will go on and on and on. And you'll have very few traditional hoplite battles fought throughout the 27-year course of the war. I want to point to a section of Thucydides that I'd like you guys to become familiar with, and this has to do with Pericles in his famous funeral oration. And in Book 2, you see chapters 35 to 46, Pericles is called upon by the people of Athens to deliver the traditional funeral address, that is commemorating the war dead of whatever conflict the city of Athens was involved in. And so it's really a remarkable speech on a number of different levels. Rhetorically, it's very eloquent, but you do get this kind of statement of what democracy, an ideal image of democracy, because throughout the speech, Pericles is taking great care to show the Athenians what they're fighting for and what they're fighting against. They are fighting for their freedom, the freedom that comes with having a democratic framework as the organizing principle of your polis's life. You are going to be fighting against the type of almost totalitarian, in Pericles, the way he describes the Spartans, as an almost totalitarian regime. So it really does resonate through the ages. Certainly it was studied with great fervor during the Cold War, when the United States and its allies were pitted against the Soviet Union and its allies. So be familiar, please, with the funeral oration. Thucydides, though, is very, very clever in how he constructs his history, because immediately after you have this ringing endorsement of democracy and Athens and all that is good in Athenian life, you get an epic tragedy. And that tragedy, of course, will be the plague, which will break out in Athens and decimate the Athenian population. Indeed, this is probably the big flaw in Pericles' defensive-based strategy of having the entire population of Attica huddle within the confines of the city of Athens. Of course, sanitation was very rudimentary back then, and it was during the summer months. It must have been a real nightmare, and of course, plague was almost inevitable. Some sort of contagion was inevitable. And this Thucydides describes in great detail. He actually caught that plague, suffered from it, and survived it. One of the few to do so. Historians still don't know what it is. There's a big debate over what exactly it was, but Thucydides gives a really gruesome description of the symptoms and the effects it had, not only on individuals, but also on the kind of civic fabric of Athens itself. And here, I'm reminded, I recently read Cormac McCarthy's book, The Road. And in the early part of that book, he has a line, I'm going to try to remember, but it's something like, the frailty of things was revealed at last, when he describes this kind of apocalyptic event that ended civilized life on Earth. Well, the frailty of things was revealed to the Athenians when they confronted this plague, and all sorts of traditions were broken. We had people not caring for their fellow citizens, family members abandoning those that grew ill. The kind of thing you can imagine with the type of plague that will kill upwards of 1/3 of the population of Athens. So juxtaposing the ringing rhetoric, the soaring rhetoric of Pericles in the funeral oration, you get almost immediately Thucydides, immediately after he wraps up the funeral oration, goes into the plague and talks about the really, really detrimental effect that it will have on Athenian life. And of course, you can imagine what it'll do to the war effort, and it almost takes them out of the war. Pericles himself will die of the plague. And without Pericles, who had been, the steady hand at the wheel of the wheel of state, without him there, things began to look very uncertain. Because, of course, Pericles' plan was risky enough as it was, going against the conventions of Greek warfare. What would happen next? Well, what happens next is you get a new generation of leaders, and this generation of leaders is going to decide to deal with issues a lot more decisively and a lot more aggressively than Pericles would. We get two examples of this. One has to do with the revolt of the polis of Mytilene, which was on the island of Lesbos, was a member of the Delian League, and decided to take advantage of the misfortune of Athens to revolt against Athenian rule and try to break out of the Delian League. The Athenians will ultimately crush the rebellion, but now a debate occurs within the Athenian assembly over how to punish the people of Mytilene. And in this debate, this Mytilene debate, it's one of the most famous passages in all of Greek historiography. Basically, Book 3, chapters 36 to 50. You get two Athenians arguing, debating within the assembly over what to do with the Mytilenean population. And a guy named Cleon, who Thucydides really doesn't like all that much, he calls him the most violent man in all of Athens, argues that you got to kill everybody. It's basically going to be the harsh punishment. That will set the example to other Delian League states that may be thinking about rebelling. And the other guy, Diodotus, offers up a more kind of softer line, but he does so not out of any sense of morality or ethics. He's just looking at expediency. He says that if you kill everybody, think about what that'll do if another revolt takes place amongst our allies. They will fight to the bitter end rather than surrender, and that's going to really cost us resources. So I won't give away who wins the debate, but again, I just want to point out you've got arguments on both sides in which morality plays no role at all. And I'll let you find out for yourselves how this particular issue is resolved. Moving on from Book 3 into Book 4, we do see the Athenians in a tough spot. Still, you're getting recurrences of the plague. The defensive strategy seems to be going nowhere. The Athenian treasury is getting a little low because the Athenians are having to buy food from their allies. They can't just take it. So we do see the Athenians really up against a wall here. And that, of course, is when they decide to throw a Hail Mary pass, if you will. And the Hail Mary pass is in the form of an expedition to sail a couple of triremes, actually more than a couple, to the west coast of the Peloponnese and land on Pylos and begin fortifying an area there in the hope of triggering a Helot revolt. And of course, those of you guys that have been really following events as we've moved through this course, particularly on Sparta, must recognize that the Helots were the Achilles heel of the Spartans. And if ever any enemy of Sparta could get the Helots to revolt, that would destabilize the entire situation for the Spartans. So in an act of almost desperation, again the Hail Mary analogy I think is appropriate, the Athenians will ultimately land a force on Pylos, and the Spartans are stopped dead in their tracks. They redirect significant resources towards quashing this threat. And again, in Book 4, as the assigned reading, I'll allow you guys to kind of read through what happens. But in short, the Athenians, led by Cleon at first, and then a general named Demosthenes, are going to be able to entrap a Spartan force on an island off the coast of the Peloponnese, tiny little strip of land that is almost touching Pylos, which itself is barely attached to the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the island of Sphacteria here. And a Spartan force gets trapped there, and the Athenians will basically wear it down by not engaging it with hoplites, but instead using lightly armed peltasts. Those are guys that throw javelins, slingers, archers, to keep a steady stream of projectiles focused on the beleaguered Spartan hoplites, who, after days and days and days of this, will ultimately surrender. And this comes as a shock to everybody, including the Athenians, that a Spartan force, rather than sort of resurrect the memory of Thermopylae and go down swinging, instead chooses to surrender. And they are taken prisoner. And now the Athenians have an ace card that they can play in getting the Spartans to the table. Now, this is in the year 425 when this occurs. A peace treaty will not be signed until 421. So you're going to have 4 more years of jockeying for position. And Thucydides introduces us to a Spartan commander, Brasidas, who is able to basically get the Athenians to sit down at the table. Even after the Athenians have won this stunning victory at Pylos, and they're holding out for the best terms that they can against the Spartans, so they're not willing to negotiate in good faith, Brasidas is able to move north with a Spartan army, take control of the Athenian city of Amphipolis, which is near Macedonia, capture it, and this puts the Athenians in a tough spot because Amphipolis was home to a lot of timber, a lot of gold mines. It was very resource rich, and without it, the Athenians would be in a hard place. So anyway, to make a long story short here, in 421, an Athenian named Nicias is able to negotiate a peace that is acceptable for the most part to both parties, and this is the Peace of Nicias. Now, in Thucydides, the peace negotiations, and ultimately the final peace of Nicaea is described in Book 5. It marks about the halfway point. This peace was supposed to last for 50 years, but it will break down relatively quickly. Indeed, armed fighting continues, although not on a large scale. And Thucydides points out why this peace treaty really never had a chance of taking hold. And but in 421, we've had 10 years of fighting, and thus ends the phase of the Peloponnesian conflict called the Archidamian War.